couple of seconds here to gather. Your faces there. Hello. I guess that's our group for a while. Welcome everybody. How are you today? I'm Dan Yeager. I'm the Executive Director of NEMA, and I'm very delighted to welcome you here to Massachusetts State Advocacy Day. This is a week-long event for us, New England Museums Week, which has been a glimmer in our eyes for some time, and Meg is making it happen for NEMA. So this is fantastic. We started out with Maine yesterday, and today we have our home state of Massachusetts, and we're really pleased with that. I'd love to see some of our veteran advocates who were with us, when was it, 2 weeks ago? Museums Advocacy Day, the federal effort, which is great, but really wonderful to have you here today. Before we get going, I'm going to turn it over to Scarlett of the NEMA office to do a land acknowledgement, and then we'll pass it over to Meg to get the proceedings going. In the meantime, if you wouldn't mind just dropping into the chat a quick hello to the group and just where you're calling in from, that'd be a great way to do our intros. So Scarlett, take it away.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. I'm at home in Worcester, Massachusetts, homelands of the Nipmuc Nation people and their allied tribes, past and present. NEMA recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society, which continues the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout New England and beyond. You can use the Indigenous peoples land map. I'm going to drop it in the chat here to find the lands where you're zooming in from or where your museum is located. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Meg.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. And it's always exciting to see so many people willing to turn out early in the morning to get to talk about advocacy. And many thanks in advance to our guest speakers who are here today, representing a lot of our great partners in advocacy here in Massachusetts. So thank you to Brian from MassHumanities, to Eric from the Mass History Alliance, and to Emily from MassCreative. So thank you all very much for being here for our second New England Museum Week. So my job today is to go over a few tips and tricks, a few do's and don'ts. We did do advocacy camp last month. So for those of you who attended, some of this is going to look very familiar, but for those of you who were not able to either attend advocacy camp or watch the recordings, here are a few basic reminders about why it's so important that we're all here today. So why is advocating important this year? Every year, it's important to be working on relationships, et cetera, because museums always want to have a seat at the table when we're talking about the eternal three: budget decisions, tax policy decisions, education department kinds of decisions happen every year. Someone's always proposing a new bill to do with any of the above. So those are the things that we hear about frequently. But this year, there are other things going on which make it even more important to stay involved. There is continuing distribution of the federal COVID relief package money. There are local revitalization initiatives going on. So you may have seen, for instance, there was an editorial letter that got sent in last week about why arts and cultural organizations should have a seat at the table in the discussions of revitalizing Boston's downtown area post-COVID. There are the midterm federal elections coming up. There are state level legislative and gubernatorial elections, which you will be hearing more about from Emily shortly. So lots of reasons to be alert and involved this year, in addition to the usual. Now, as a reminder for those of you who are new to advocacy, advocacy is just on the sliding scale of things you do already. So you already have a lot of the basic skills that you need in order to be able to advocate. So there are degrees of interaction. The most basic is public relations. You let people know you exist and what you're up to. In education, you are telling people and you're educating them about things to do with your mission. Advocacy is just the next step beyond that. Advocacy is still at its core education, and it's teaching people about how your mission and your organization intersect with civic life and specific causes. And then the next step beyond is the thing that often the word scares a lot of people. But lobbying is when you just take that next step and say, now you know why this is important. We are asking you to do X about it. Now, you do not have to register as a lobbyist to be able to make that kind of ask. You can make that kind of ask as an employee of a nonprofit. But there are a couple of guidelines that you should keep in place. So the very most basic rule for nonprofits is that you can talk about issues, you cannot talk about people. So if you are interested in getting, say, your member base involved in supporting a specific issue, or if you want to be able to give them information that will help inform their voting, you can do that as long as you stick to the issues. And you can ask people for support for specific issues that matter to your organization, but you have to do it in a nonpartisan way. So anything that you do, you have to make sure you're offering equal opportunities to folks of any party. So if somebody contacts you and says, gee, would really like to run a campaign event at your site, you can say yes, but if somebody on the opposing side calls and makes the same request, you also have to say yes. You can send around a questionnaire to all of the candidates in a race to get their platform on specific things that are important to your organization, and you can publish them, but you cannot selectively edit them, and you cannot choose to only publish some. You know, you can say, we sent questionnaires to all 4 of the candidates in this race, 2 of them responded, and here are their answers. But you cannot then say, and therefore, based on their questions, we really recommend that you vote for X. That one's right out. You can give people the information, but you can't tell them what to do. You can, however, reach out to people who are already in office and say, this matters to our institution, and we hope you will support this bill, or we hope you will vote against this bill because it will be detrimental because XYZ. If you are worried about doing any of that on work time, then you are still allowed to do it as an individual and say, I work for this nonprofit, but as a unique constituent, I really want you to support XYZ. And the guidelines there are make sure that you're doing any of your tweeting or emailing from your own accounts and do it on your own time. Lunch break, other kind of break. If you're doing flex time, it can be in standard work hours as long as they're not technically your hours. And if there are multiple of you from the same organization who are interested in doing advocacy, make sure you're talking to each other before you do so that everybody is giving the same message. Massachusetts was the last state house to reopen in New England, but there's still a real focus on virtual contact this year as there was last year. So social media is still really important for getting people's attention and raising issues. Attending virtual town halls and listening sessions is still really important. Getting yourself signed up for your legislators' newsletters and mailing lists and inviting them to sign up for yours, that's super important. Oftentimes they'll have like a general contact the office info at kind of address that you can just add into your mailing list. You can send them emails, you can call the offices, you can try to set up virtual meetings. All of those are equally important in terms of reaching out and contacting your elected officials. A couple of guidelines for when you're using social media. If you want somebody to really see it, you got to make sure that you tag them. So use their handle to make sure that they see it. Use some relevant hashtags, not so many that it's just a big screen full of blue because that makes people's eyes glaze over. But, you know, pick somewhere between 3 to 5 relevant hashtags and, you know, either work them into your text as you can see in this example here, or put some at the bottom to help people find it. So things about your location, if there's a tag specifically for your town, or in Massachusetts, the hashtag MAPOLI, MapPoli, covers a lot of like what's happening politically in the state. So that's a good one to use. For an event like this, it's really, really helpful to us as organizers if you use our event hashtag so that we can track the amount of engagement that's happening through an event like this. So please make sure that you're using hashtag Newing Museum Week when you're posting, because that helps us see and measure and be able to compare it to last year and all of that kind of good stuff. Anything else that might be, say, a popular hashtag that people follow, like Throwback Thursday or, you know, Museum Object Monday or whatever else, something that might help spread the visibility. Or if you're talking about climate change, the hashtag Green Museums, those are a really useful one, that kind of thing. And again, this is something you already need you already know how to do. Pretend it's an exhibit label. Make sure that whatever information you're trying to get across is punchy and memorable and concise. So pick your strongest statistics, the ones that are going to give people a really clear picture of the context, things that make sense and that are going to stick in the memory. So, cultural and heritage travelers spend 60% more money on average than other travelers. So as tourism is reviving, that kind of thing is an important statistic to share. Here's another really good one. The public opinion poll that AAM conducted in 2017 showed that 96% of voters say they support government funding for museums. So that's a just gigantic amount of the population. You don't get 96% agreement on pretty much anything in this country, but 96% of voters say they support legislators who support museum funding, and that's a really big deal. And those sort of big picture statistics are great and important for setting the context, but the power of your story is in your unique, specific details. So you want to make sure that when you are making an ask or anything else, that you talk about what is specific and personal to you and your organization. Make sure it's informative and make sure it's timely. If you're telling a story that happened 10 years ago, they're going to be a lot less interested than if you're telling a story about something that happened 2 months ago. You do not need to start from scratch. There are a lot of great templates out there. There are a number of them on the NEMA website. So here are 2. We have 4 different economic, educational, environmental, and equity-centered impact statement templates that you can find. We've also got the Work Your Words worksheet, which is a very basic, like, how do you put what you need to say in 3 or 4 punchy sentences kind of framework. So those are all available on the NEMA website. And I'm trusting that Scarlett, the link queen, is dropping those in the chat as I speak. And remember, you are never alone. There is a wide field of people who are here to help you with advocacy, including our fabulous guest speakers today. But beyond the region, there are, of course, great advocacy resources from AAM and Americans for the Arts and AASLH. The History Relevance Group has some really interesting talking points. Your state level agencies, MassHumanities and Mass Cultural Council, they are there with figures and things that can help you out, state nonprofit networks. And of course, we have actually been dropping some resources into the hashtags museums advocacy and Doing Museum Week running up to this event. So if you just scroll back through some of those, you'll see some of the stuff that we've been highlighting from our advocacy resource library already. All right. Text communications, it's really important to remember your A's. Attitude can come across a little strange through text if there's not vocal inflection behind it. So think really carefully about how you're wording things. Think about your audience, whether you're gearing a tweet towards your members or the general public or to a specific governing body. That may change your tone a little bit. And also your asks. You want to make sure that you are sharing the information that will get people to do what you're asking them to do. Like, we're celebrating the impact that our museum has had on school children over the past 50 years. If you ever went on a field trip to our museum, please tell us about it here in this thread, that kind of thing. When you are thinking about reaching out to your legislators, a little research really, really helps. Make sure that you do a quick scan of their publicly available information, whether that's through the State House website, or they usually have a private kind of, personal political website. Check their social media feeds, have a look at what kind of bills they've recently signed on to, et cetera. And that will tell you what their priorities are and help you frame your approach to them in a way that's going to get their attention. If you got a legislator who's really, really into small businesses, talk about the fact that most museums are small businesses. And make sure that you're also in it yourself. Your passions and your anxieties are really compelling and they will help get people's attention. If you do manage to make contact with any offices today or this week, follow-up is really important. So if they like your post on Twitter or they retweet it or something like that, then you can follow up with their office and say, thanks so much for engaging with us during this week. We'd like to invite you and your staff to come visit our organization, that kind of thing, so that you're using this as a stepping stone to building a bigger relationship. All right. And now, my favorite number, 100% of you are ready to get out there and do some advocating, and don't forget your caffeine. It's very important. All right, and now I'm going to pass it over to Emily from MassCreative. Please feel free, if you've got any questions, to drop them in the chat, and I will be answering them in the background.
My goodness, Meg, you always do such a thorough job, and I just want to co-sign, endorse all of the information that she shared with you. There is one thing that might also help. So before I start, MassCreative is a state arts and cultural advocacy organization. So our work, we work with NEMA quite a bit. We work with MassHumanities quite a bit. We work with the Mass Cultural Council and partners like you to make sure that that the arts and cultural community's needs are being considered by elected officials and decision makers on the local, state, and federal level. And one of the things, and so for the last, let's see, since March of 2020, we've been talking a lot about some new needs, right? And working really hard to find ways to ensure that the arts and cultural and humanities are included in any recovery plans or spending that the legislature puts together in Massachusetts, as well as that Congress puts together. And so I think for us, one of the big wins was right around the turn of the new year, the legislature released their first American Rescue Plan Act spending bill that included $60 million in grants that the Mass Cultural Council will distribute to arts, culture, and humanities organizations and individuals. And that is a direct result of the united effort that many of you participated in. And so that's how MassCreative sees its work. It is about how do we help everyone engage in making sure that our elected officials understand the value of arts, culture, and humanities, as well as what we need in order to stay strong. And that doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because one or two very large, sort of internationally known organizations engage. In fact, you and your organizations are actually some of the most powerful advocates and ambassadors that we have. And the reason is because you make every one of these decisions for our legislators local. At the end of the day, the way our government works is, right, elected officials answer to their constituents. And so when they understand that there is a museum in their backyard, a historical society in their backyard, or another arts and cultural or history attraction in their backyard that is actively serving their communities, it's a different relationship than, oh, that's just Boston's problem, or, oh, that's just the Cape's tourism revenue, or the Berkshires. That arts and culture and the humanities are integral in the fabric of every single community in Massachusetts. And so when you speak up and share those stories, as Meg pointed out, it really makes a difference. You cannot imagine how much of a difference it makes. One other piece that's, I think, a pretty interesting tool that the National Assembly of State Arts and Agencies put together is a bit of a messaging guide. And this was actually created in part to help arts and cultural advocates who are perhaps in congressional districts that are fairly fiscally conservative, talk to their elected officials about the need for arts and culture funding. And I think we all make an assumption that Massachusetts is a deep blue state, but we all know that there are a lot of different political leanings, and that our elected officials are always thinking about how they are going to manage the funds that they are entrusted with allocating responsibly. And so some of this messaging might be an additional resource that might be helpful. You might enjoy looking through in terms of constructing some of your arguments. I want to talk today about sort of three highlighted things that you might be interested in, opportunities to engage. So the first one is that the legislature right now, the budget season has been kicked off in Massachusetts. So in January, the governor released his version of the budget. And that's sort of the opening, that's the kickoff, right, in the Super Bowl game. And he recommended, and so the thing that we look at, which is sort of the main public investment mechanism for arts and culture is the annual appropriation to the Mass Cultural Council. And so for the first time in Governor Baker's history, he actually didn't recommend cutting the budget. He actually recommended level funding for the agency. So he recommended about $20.1 million. Yes, claps, good work, Governor Baker, right? He's on his way out and he's more than happy to make friends. And so what happens now is that the legislature will take that up. And in some ways, the legislature is like, thanks, Baker, for starting the process, but we're going to write our own versions. And so right now, literally right now, the House Ways and Means Committee, that's chaired by Aaron Michaelwitz, who represents the North End and Chinatown areas of Boston, is just constructing their version of the budget. And as part of the process, there were hearings, and Michael Bobbitt, who's the executive director of the Mass Cultural Council, testified at that hearing and made the request for $27.4 million for the agency. Now, you might be wondering, $27.4 million. That's a pretty specific number. How'd they get to that number? That number is the high water mark for the agency. It's the highest amount the agency has ever received in its history, and it happened in 1998. Happened in 1988. So we're looking to, let's get back to that high water mark. Yes, that doesn't account for inflation. That would take us up to about $64 million. And so strategically asking to go from $21 million to $64 million in 1 year is a pretty tall ask, but 27.4 is a reasonable ask. And I think one that we are all interested in supporting and backing. So please be on the lookout. If you're on our email list, we will be sharing ways to engage in that budget process. The next piece is that many of you know that we work in a 2-year legislative cycle, so that each session of the legislature is 2 full calendar years, starting January 1 and running through December 31st. And we are in the 2nd year of that legislative cycle. And so the bulk, like the majority of all legislation that they're going to get done this session is going to get done by the end of July, before they go back to their districts to run for office or run for re-election. And so there are some pretty big ticket bills that we are just monitoring and taking a look at. The priority for President Spilka in that Senate is a mental health bill package that she's been championing for quite a while. On the House side, Speaker Mariano is very passionate about sports betting, making it legal in Massachusetts. And that's where we are really paying attention, because the last time that gaming legislation was put into place in Massachusetts, there was money set aside for the arts and cultural community in whatever tax revenue was collected. And so we are starting conversations with lawmakers to talk about how can we make sure that once again, as gambling is introduced, a new version of gambling is introduced in Massachusetts, a portion of that tax revenue is invested in the arts, cultural, and humanities, right? So please be on the lookout. There may be some more information coming your way about that. And then finally, and Meg really talked about this, we have some pretty big ticket elections coming up. I think for a lot of us, the biggest one that we sort of first were introduced to is a presidential election. But in Massachusetts, in November, the entire legislature will be elected or re-elected, as well as all of our statewide officers. And that includes governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, auditor, treasurer. I think I caught them all. I might be missing one, but I think that's all of them. The races that so in the past, MassCreative has worked with partners like you to make sure that when candidates are on the campaign trail, they are hearing from people who care about the arts and culture and humanities in their communities, are engaged or working in the arts, culture, and humanities sector, and are thinking about ways that the candidates can support or think about building policy platforms that would strengthen and build a more inclusive and equitable arts, culture, and humanities sector in Massachusetts. And we're going to do that again. So on the line with me, she doesn't have her video on, but is Karen Alzair, who is our Create the Vote campaign manager this year. Karen, glad to see you here. And we are going to do that. We are going to launch in a couple, we're still in the quiet phase of our campaign, but we are recruiting right now for folks to join us as coalition members of the Create the Vote campaign. And the way this works is that we're going to engage in a series of activities that make sure that candidates running for governor and lieutenant governor know we're here, know our issues, know what we want, and also understand that there is a big constituency that cares about these items. As Meg pointed out, voters who see that their elected officials care about museum funding are more supporting of those candidates. We need to make sure that that's clear to them in many different ways and many different activities. So we hope you will join us in that work. Meg very kindly put a link in the chat. I'm also going to put the email for Karen in the chat. So if you want to reach out to her directly to say, yeah, I want to be on board. Our organization wants to be on board. You can get signed up really quickly. This kind of work sometimes scares folks. And I want to call back to what Meg said, which is this is a further deepening of your mission. Arts, culture, and humanities are deeply embedded in the civic life of our communities. And part of that civic life is engaging in elections, both in terms of making sure that people understand where and how they can vote, as well as educating folks on the candidates and their positions in a nonpartisan way. This campaign is 100% nonpartisan. So we hope you will join us. I'm going to drop a couple of other links in the chat to help you out, but we are always here as Recess and very glad to be here today. Thank you, Meg and Dan, for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I do encourage folks to check out what's going on with Create the Vote, because the pilot that they did last year with the Boston mayoral election was really cool. And, we've all who participated and learned a lot, and I'm really excited about the gubernatorial version for this year. So next, I'm going to pass it over to Brian Boyles from MassHumanities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meg. Thanks to the whole staff for NEMA. Putting this together, it takes a lot of work, and I think it kicks off this season in just the energetic way we want to do. But you guys do great work all year round, and we're really glad to partner with you. Everyone that was just listening heard Emily Ruddock say the humanities like 12 times. That's huge progress. I'm really glad to hear the humanities part of advocacy. That's certainly where I come from. And while it is sort of an inside joke with us, I think it's really important when it comes to museum work, because too much of the time that term doesn't express an open door. What you guys do is the work on the ground that actually does show the humanities count and that they're a big part of civic engagement. And I think that's why it's relevant to any advocacy question, because what we all do is create a lot of meaning in the places that we're in. And I think that emphasis on local is where we all punch above our weight. Right. And MassHumanities goes to bat for those small organizations, whether it's, walking into a congressional meeting, or I think in the funding we do. And the funding we do really, really relies on public support. And fortunately, it's grown over the last few years. And we've been able to do things that I think we didn't think we'd be able to do, and specifically supporting museums in staffing and operational costs. Those are things we want to keep doing. We need significantly more funding to be able to do that in an impactful way. Right. So what I'm going to do in a second is just share a few slides on what we're up to and how we're framing this for advocacy purposes, because I think it's good for you to hear how we're doing it, because a lot of what we're doing is pointing to the work you do when we go in and make these cases. MassHumanities is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So it was just 2 days ago that the omnibus bill was passed. Was it 2 days ago? I've been out of town. I think I was in DC when it passed, so I know it was a big deal. So when NEH receives $180 million, that increase filters down to MassHumanities as a state affiliate. So that means we get probably around $50,000 more over the year. At Mass Cultural Council, we have an MOU in place with them where we receive 3.77% of their overall budget. We put all of that money back out into grants last year. I think we're putting 99% of that money back out into grants this year. So I say that because while we do have this public support, we do everything we can to maximize the impact of it. So when you're going out there and advocating for MCC or MassHumanities, know that that money is going to come back out and hit the ground. The last piece to that is we should be receiving some of the state ARPA money through MCC. And as soon as we know how much that is, we'll be putting the word out. But what I can share with you is we're looking to continue the operational support that we did with the CARES grants and the SHARP grants. And I think that's the biggest thing the field really needs right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just what our plans are and how I think that they're part of the case. And, happy to hear questions or ideas about any of that. Always got to start the right slide. So we launched a new strategic plan and a new mission in 2021. So it's just now us rolling it out. And you can see that the mission statement here is not, reinventing MassHumanities so much as saying very clearly the humanities are part of public life and they're part of what actually goes on out there to create a more equitable Commonwealth. And the work we've been doing, I think, has been driving towards that. But particularly when I go to meet with legislators, being able to say very clearly that's what we're committed to is, I think, opening new eyes to the humanities. We are the state affiliate of the NEH. We have done several key projects around the state for the last 48 years. We do note that starting in 2019, there was a big spike in our grant making. And while that is tied to the increase from the COVID relief, it was also part of streamlining that we wanted to do to make things easier for you and offer a lot more funding. So the non-COVID relief jumped from 550 to about 695,000 in just that year alone. You can see we do rely on this advocacy. So it's something we're thinking about year in and year out. That's the jump in grants over the last couple of years. That's both the number of grants we've awarded and the amount of money we've put out there. I think the demand is incredible. We had 180 people show up for a grant workshop 2 weeks ago. That's a record for us, I think, given the fact that we only have every year less than $1 million to give out, and not counting the COVID funds. These are the things we've been doing. And I think they're important because, again, this is a matter of making it a lot easier to get funding from MassHumanities. And they're all things that I think you can go to bat with when you have these grants. Specifically, I think digital capacity is something that legislators really respond to. The idea that you all as a field are trying to reach more people, trying to build out your digital capacity is something that resonates. The Bridge Street Fund is something that we made easily available for history organizations. A lot of museums took advantage of this. I know a lot of organizations are getting audience through online programs, but what you're not getting is revenue. MassHumanities is going to continue to fund at a low level, but enough to make sure that your staff and your speakers are being covered. Again, I think in the case you make, it's, we can't keep doing this for free. And as we start to rebuild, we really do need support. The last thing that I noted about who we fund is we really do hit the small organizations, and that's a commitment we're going to continue to keep, whether the funding goes way up or stays the same. So you can see that, way more than half of the COVID relief funds that we put out went to organizations of $500,000 or less. We spread that out pretty well across the state. And if we receive more ARPA funding from MCC, we're going to use a very similar model to reach as many people as possible. These are just facts about the grant making that we've done over the last year. I mentioned the SHARP funds and the small organizations. We are also pushing to make sure it's a much more inclusive, representative group of organizations that are receiving these funds. And again, MassHumanities, I think, does a really, really strong job of bringing it out region by region so that we can actually say we're investing more per capita in the Berkshires than we are in Metro Boston. These are the grants that are coming up. The Bridge Street Fund, again, is the online programming. The Reading Fairly Douglas Together program, I'll talk about in a minute, but a lot of museums have been doing this work. Staffing the Humanities is operational support for past MassHumanities grantees. So that's the short-term operational funding. If we receive additional funding through ARPA, we're going to obviously expand that, and we'll expand it past just the past MassHumanities grantee, but to organizations who are doing humanities work. Any museum would fit into either of those buckets. And Expand Massachusetts Stories, the LOI for that is coming up in a couple of weeks. I think this is important in the way we make the case, and I'll talk about it quickly. Our new strategic plan, I think, all falls under this umbrella of civic engagement. So we really think that it's not just enough to say that we want to engage, but that we have to actively connect the legislators with the work that's going on. You know that all the great work that happens in a small museum doesn't bubble up to those folks nearly enough. MassHumanities wants to leverage our public position and our role as a state affiliate of NEH to make those connections happen. The Smithsonian Museum on Main Street, I think, is important. This is the first time we've brought this project to the state. It will reach 6 different communities this year and next year. We will continue to do this project. I think what's important here is that we are already meeting with legislators and saying, look, MassHumanities is making a 3-year commitment to Rutland, to Essex, to Hull, to Montague, and Sheffield. We want to use that case, I think, to advocate for more support, because we know that those small organizations strengthen their small towns. And crucially, what we're doing here is offering those organizations not a 1-year grant, but a 2-year grant, so that once they do this exhibition, they're able to then keep that momentum going for another year. It's a pilot, really, for sustained multi-year funding, and I hope to have good news about that as the funding picture becomes more clear. Expand Massachusetts Stories grants. I think this is important because museums really drove this. We were seeing museums do oral history projects with local residents who hadn't been in their collections before, growing exhibitions from that, growing programs from that, and growing audiences from that. The legislators I talked to, particularly in urban areas, really appreciate the idea that we are actively using our Mass Cultural Council funds to create work where people can walk in and see themselves on the walls of your museum. And I know that's a trend that's going on in museums large and small. That's something that we've continued to advocate for. I did put a note in here, and I know that the Revolution 250 group is working. What I would say is that we're looking to do this kind of funding and this kind of projects because we know that the Revolution anniversary in 2026 needs to be inclusive, and it needs to not just reach Boston, it needs to reach organizations all around the state. We're sort of setting this up as an on-ramp for that. The Douglas program is the readings we host of Douglas's 4th of July speech. What's powerful about that is that in that little blip of time when we all felt safe to come out from COVID, museums actually chose to do the really difficult thing of reading this very powerful speech about democracy and slavery on their front steps and in town commons. I do think that there's opportunity as museums go forward to really make that case that you are leaders in that type of work. It's a familiar entity that you present, but I think it's also an issue that a lot of legislators know needs to come to the fore. You're right there, ready to lead. The Clemente course in the Humanities is not as museum focused, but we are trying to work with local organizations to connect more of the underserved population that takes the Clemente course with local museums to continue to really diversify the sector. The thing I said at the beginning, we're going to take a much more active role in championing this work through original content, through media partnerships, and through a lot more of a focused approach to who we work with on the legislative side, including working with MassCreative more concertedly. We really feel like it's our job to do that. And I'm happy to talk with organizations who are interested in doing that over the next year. I think that on the grant making side, we're going to create special opportunities for grantees to really tap into these resources, because we know that so much of what you do happens locally, and it's hard to bubble it up to a bigger audience. And when you bubble it up to a bigger audience, the local stakeholders sometimes take note. We want to actively do that and help you leverage that kind of thing. Like I said, the new grant lines are open now. So those will be closing, 2 of them in April, but others are open and rolling. The Douglas events take place in July. We do the Governor's Awards in October every year. We've never had the governor actually attend, but we hope to do that this year as a goodbye or as a hello to the new governor, and certainly continue to make that, I think, a much more advocacy-focused event. That's what we are up to this year. Again, I would thank you all for the letters you do send to legislators when you get a MassHumanities grant. Those do come back to us. They make it so that when we walk in the door, they know exactly who we are. And I think that as we do that in the federal and the state level, it's really important that we know what you all are doing, and that it does fall under the civic engagement umbrella. That's all I have for today.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was fabulous and super helpful. So next, we'll turn it over to Eric to give us a brief update on what's up with Mass History Alliance and what their advocacy priorities are, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. Please feel free to keep dropping them in the chat as you come up with them.
Thank you so much, Meg. really, it's a real privilege to be here amongst some pretty big players. I'd have to say in particular, Emily is a real inspiration to anybody that wants to advocate. She does not give up. It's just really inspiring. And also Brian has been a tremendous supporter of the organization I'm representing today, and that is the Mass History Alliance. We are just a group of mostly mom and pop organizations, or I think there are about 200 of us, and most of them are struggling. And so we try to advocate for them. We want to inspire them, as you guys have inspired us, to raise their voice and to be heard in some way or another. And often they're challenged, don't even have internet sometimes. So we really work hard to communicate with them to try to get those issues out and forward and get them in the right direction so that somebody can respond to them. And so that takes a bunch of work, and I have to say it often is discouraging because you're not sure if you're having an impact, but you can always have an impact. It's always about getting your foot in the door and not letting it slam down because your foot's still in the door and no one's closing that. So we have at the Mass History Alliance, we have something called the Conversations on the Commons. And this is a really interesting way to kind of advocate in the sense that you're not alone. These are subjects that are group discussions, very informal, and they tend to be something that everybody can engage with all across the board. And we've had, I think, 36 of these conversations over the last couple of years once we founded that website, and I'm gonna put that in the chat. The Mass History Commons is really what we're coming into, which is sort of a centralized place where the tiny mom and pop places and historical societies, museums, of course, also can come in and find the things they need to do their business. You know, whether that's support from various groups or particular answers to, let's say, collection issues, anything. And when we have the conversations, that's when people really get inspired, and they can be across, as I mentioned, almost any subject. So we welcome you to join us, even if you're not a member of the Mass History Alliance, and be part of those talks and see what your neighbors have to say and people across the state. Let's see. What we do also is not just about preservation, but it's also about promoting history. So it's all about the fact that we love our history in Massachusetts. Our entire organization is spread across the entire state. So there are things that are being lost every minute, but there are also tremendous achievements that are happening every minute. So it's very exciting to be involved with that. And basically, I ask you, please come check out the Mass History Alliance website and join us for a conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. So does anybody have any questions or concerns or thoughts that we haven't had a chance to address yet before you get out there and start talking to folks about how awesome your museums are?
Hey, Meg, if I could just take a second to reflect something here. You know, it strikes me that, first of all, there is a fun fact about our region in general, is we have the highest per capita number of museums of anywhere in the United States, about double the national average. And that comes out just reflecting on what Eric said and knowing how much of our museum landscape is, in fact, small historical societies and whatnot. And, you know, we all know as we drive throughout the Commonwealth that virtually every town has got some form of small museum of some kind. And, you know, I always remark about how when you walk into some of those places, they have these unbelievable national, international treasures, you know, significant history happened here. And so, you know, it's just, I guess I'm saying it for two reasons. First of all, I'm so pleased that we are all coming together and collaborating on a scale that we've never really done before. And that's really terrific. I'm also really, you know, pleased to hear Brian and Emily and seeing their operations, you know, collaborating and coming together, and especially Brian on the grant making side of things, you know, with the grants to the small museums, so important. And in particular, this move that I'm seeing on the part of grant makers, you know, allowing operational funding to take place as opposed to just simply project funding. That's a huge transition. and, you know, encouraging everybody, of course, to keep that up, because that's ultimately what our smaller museums need more than anything, is just that sort of ongoing operational support. And, you know, I think that that's something that we really have to keep in mind and keep the pressure up, that that's, you know, really the bottom line of what we actually need. The mechanism is changing that way. And I'm glad to see it. But anyway, I think that, you know, just that power in numbers, our collaborations are really a good sign. And I'm so pleased that everybody's on board here today to, you know, kind of exercise their advocacy muscle and to get out there and continue the good work on speaking up for museums. So thanks very much.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I am in the middle of answering Meredith's question in the chat, which is, how can you find some of those resources that we referenced in our discussion this morning? So AAM has a lot of the museums and public opinion, museums as economic engines, some really great infographics to use in their advocacy section of their website. So I just dropped the link in the chat. You can also find some pre-made graphics on our website for New England Museum Week. You're welcome to download and use any of those in your messaging. So as a quick recap, you know, your goal for this week is to reach out to your legislators by phone or email or tweet, or to reach out to your members and talk about why public support for museums makes a difference, and encourage them to reach out to their legislators in support of, say, increased funding for the Mass Cultural Council, et cetera. You can also reach out to your federal level representatives if you didn't already do that with AAM during Museums Advocacy Day a couple of weeks ago. And you can get all of the AAM talking points from the link that I dropped in the chat there as well. You want to be looking for the page that says Issues at a Glance. That's what gives you the talking point and the specific asks that we were using a couple of weeks ago. So you can send like a support email or tweet to those offices to follow up on what we were all talking about when we were virtually visiting the Hill a few weeks ago. So I hope everybody is feeling inspired and feeling confident enough to be able to reach out and do some advocating. We do have a few more minutes, so if anybody else has any questions or any feedback that they'd like to offer, please feel free to unmute yourself and chat now, or drop it in the chat if you don't feel like talking.
Meg, there was a question in there. Could you talk about individual organization lobbying for your own organization versus statewide advocacy for state issues like funding?
Okay,
that's
sure.
a big one.
Yeah, okay, well, it's important to do both is the baseline answer. So advocating for your own organization most often ends up looking like, say, asking your legislator to write a letter of support for a grant application or things like that. That tends to be the kind of thing that one is advocating for as an individual organization. Collective advocacy is really important. So that's why we ask folks like Brian and Emily to let us know what's going on legislatively and, you know, where the legislators need to hear supporting evidence for why they should or should not be supporting certain things. So Emily or Brian, do you have anything else you want to add to that in terms of individually versus collectively advocating?
Yeah, if it's okay. So, you know, our position is that the Mass Cultural Council and the MassHumanities are two bodies that have excellent best practices around distributing money within the sector through a lens of equity, through a lens of regional diversity, through lenses of diversity of disciplines. And so, you know, I think this comes down to, so we are always going to push and sort of direct that the advocacy work that we do is about directing those agencies to be invested with more dollars, or other state agencies, right? Because there's an actual grant and transparent process. But when we're talking about how, you know, engaging, you know, legislators for specific funding requests, or they're often called earmarks, I think this is actually a choice point frankly, for a lot of predominantly white institutions, right? There's a history of how, in Massachusetts, of how predominantly white and well-funded arts organizations have leveraged their relationships and their power to make sure that they get both they get earmarks or they get additional funding on top of the money that they're getting from our state agencies. And, you know, if we're really thinking about how do we make sure that every person in Massachusetts can equitably access arts and culture, can see their cultures reflected and celebrated, then we need to do some hard thinking about how we choose to advocate, and when we choose to advocate solely for our organization versus advocating for the whole. And that's not a decision that I can make for you, or I can, you know, but I think it's a choice point that I hope we're all sort of taking a beat and thinking about in this moment in time.
All right. Well, I guess at this point, I'm just checking to see if Eric or Emily or Brian have any last thoughts that you didn't get a chance to share or that have kind of risen to the top as you've been listening to everybody else talking and asking questions. Anything else to add?
You know, I think on our side, because the NEA and NEH budgets just got approved so late, right? Because everything is going Washington, we don't know what the ask is for the coming year. So we're late on that. I point that out not because it's the most inspirational way to end today's conversation. However, I do think without being partisan here, we've got to build up that funding because we don't know what happens in a couple of years, and we got to diversify our funding, and we got to get our state funding up. Okay. I speak for myself probably more than anyone because I rely on that funding, but I do think making a strong case over the next 2 years and being in the kind of concerted effort that you guys have organized today is super important because we know the bigger context.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our fabulous guest speakers. Thank you to all of you for showing up. As one of our speakers mentioned yesterday, the most important part of advocacy is showing up. Being there to show your support and being vocal is the most important thing. So you are all already rock stars, and I'm really looking forward to see what you get up to out there on social media. I have been haunting the New England Museum Week tag all week. So feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions going forward. I'm dropping my email in the chat, and otherwise, we will see you out in the wilds of Advocacy Week. So thank you again.
All right, thanks, everybody. See ya.